It seems, VisualEconomik community, that China is on red alert. A massive real estate crisis threatens to blow up its main economic driving force. The construction sector has gorged itself in a big way over the past few years, and now the Asian giant could be about to suffer a huge case of indigestion. Practically 30% of the entire Chinese economy has come to be devoted to bricks and mortar. Prices have skyrocketed, developers have run up huge debts, and the banks are up to their necks in the whole thing. As you can imagine, the situation seems so alarming that headlines like this one have flooded the front pages of all the media outlets.
China is on the edge as fallout from its real estate crisis spreads.
The international media are not mincing words. China is facing a really tough situation. However, what if we told you that all this news could be false? What if we told you that in reality, the dreaded Chinese real estate bubble could be one big lie? That, at least, is what several analysts and media outlets close to China claim. According to them, the alleged real estate bubble could be nothing more than a gross manipulation. The key data in this whole affair may be being misinterpreted, and some are even claiming that this is nothing more than pure Western propaganda designed to damage the image of a prosperous and thriving China. Look at this.
China doesn't have a housing bubble. The high housing prices in large Chinese cities are not signs of speculative demand.
Well, in this video, we're going to examine the arguments that indicate that the Chinese real estate bubble could be false. Let's go through them one by one. We will analyze the data in detail to discover the whole truth. And finally, we will discuss what the future may hold for China over the next few years. Are you ready? Well, let's get started. To understand whether or not the allegations of a bubble in China are false, we first have to answer the most basic question of all. What really is a real estate bubble? Well, if we go to the common definition, which we can see in Wikipedia, a bubble happens when the price of an asset greatly exceeds its intrinsic value, its real value. But applying this definition to the case of the housing market, we could say that a housing bubble occurs when the price of houses far exceeds the real value of living in them. So the question is, how can we differentiate the real value of living in a house from its market price? That is, how can we know if houses are very expensive because they provide a lot of value as homes, or on the contrary, are they very expensive because there is a bubble inflating their price? Well, here we can look at several data points that can give us interesting clues. For example, we can all agree that a good indicator of the real value of a house is the rental price. Think about it. When everyone wants to live in a place, as is the case in big cities, rents are very expensive. Homes have a very high real value, and that is precisely because everyone wants to live in them. Meanwhile, in places where no one wants to live, such as remote villages, rents tend to be very low. The homes have little real value. Well, to know if there is a real estate bubble, we can compare the rental prices with the price of housing. In other words, if purchase prices are very high but rents are low, then there is a clear warning of a bubble. And you know what? In the case of China, the data points precisely to a bubble. Compared to other countries such as the US, housing prices are very high relative to rents. So that's the first warning. But there's more. Another bubble indicator besides rental prices is the income indicator. In a low-income country, citizens cannot spend much on their homes, and therefore it does not make much sense for housing to be very expensive. Unless, of course, citizens buy houses by going massively into debt and fostering a huge speculative bubble. Or, to put it another way, if housing prices are much higher than citizens' incomes, once again, bubble alert. So what about China? Well, exactly the same as before. In China, it takes more than 30 years of average income to pay for a house. Much more than in the US, where only 5 years of average income is needed. As you can see, the main indicators are clear. China has a huge housing bubble. Housing prices far exceed their real housing value. But as we have said, this data could be being misinterpreted. The bubble alarm could be a complete lie. Why? Well, there are mainly two reasons that could explain these data errors. Let's take a look at them. Let's see, it is true that the purchase price of housing in China is very high in relation to rents. But here we must remember one important factor. China comes from being a very poor, mainly rural country, where citizens are now moving to the big cities in droves. Specifically, 40% of China's entire population still lives in rural areas, and more than half are expected to move to cities in the coming years. And that is important for two reasons. On the one hand, China is going to need to build a lot of houses in the coming decades, and that is what would explain the huge presence presence of its real estate sector by no means a bubble, so the real estate sector would not run any risk of going bankrupt soon. However, on the other hand, as the influx of people into the cities progresses, you would expect rents to rise. And what does that imply? China's high purchase price to rent ratio is going to get lower and lower over the years, and therefore there is no bubble alarm. It is simply that rents have not yet had time to rise sufficiently. And VisualEconomik viewers, this brings us to the second error in the data that warns of a bubble. Remember that the second bubble indicator was the one that said that housing prices in China are much higher than citizens' income. Specifically, it takes more than 30 years of income of the average citizen to pay for a house, and that is madness. Even so, there are important details to pay attention to here, because yes, on the one hand, it is true that Chinese incomes are very low, but on the other hand, those incomes are growing like crazy every year. China is one of the fastest growing countries in the world economically, and therefore, as revenues increase, the difference with prices is going to narrow. In other words, once again, the data has not had time to adjust. There is no bubble. But watch out, because there is still more. Take a look at the following news item.
China's GDP is man-made, unreliable.
According to sources close to China, based on what leaked documents suggest, China's GDP could be mismeasured. According to them, China could be much wealthier than the data says. From this point of view, given its cultural characteristics, China has a strong underground economy that does not appear in the official figures, not even in the Chinese government's own figures. So it's not that housing is too expensive relative to income, it's that income is maybe much higher than the statistics say. In the same vein, another criticism of those who warn of the real estate bubble is that they do not fully understand the Chinese reality. Many of the analysts or journalists who speak on the subject are neither Chinese nor have they lived in the country, so they are incapable of understanding the reality on the street or the true nature of the data. So, in summary, the bubble accusations could be false for three essential reasons. The first is that urban growth is going to require a very large real estate market that will change prices over time. The second is that China is going to grow a lot economically. And the third is that the data could be mismeasured. Now, what is the truth in all this? And are the bubble accusations really a hoax? Well, I can already tell you that it's not as simple as it seems, so stay tuned.
The devil is in the details.
Well, let's get one thing straight. It is certain that China will continue to undergo a very large urbanization process in the coming years, and therefore, many houses will need to be built in large cities over the next few decades. Nevertheless, there is one problem in this whole story. Developers are building houses in the wrong places. As you can see, practically 80% of all housing built in recent years in China is being built in small cities. That is to say, housing is not being built in the big cities. It is not being built where a lot of people are likely to move to live in the next few years. The real estate sector is not keeping pace with Chinese urbanization. So what does that mean, you may ask? Well, it means that houses are not being built where they are needed. It means that the argument that the real estate sector is so big because China, sooner or later, will need to build a lot in the big cities is simply false. China doesn't build in the big cities. It builds mostly in the small cities. What's more, what is really worrying is that small cities are losing population. In other words, 80% of the houses in China are being built in places where fewer and fewer people live. And I'm sure you're beginning to see the problem, right? If almost everything that is built in China is built in places where there is no need for more housing, there will come a time when those houses will not sell. The price will suddenly plummet. The real estate companies will have huge problems with their debts. The financing system will suffer defaults, and all those construction workers will lose their jobs. Or, to put it more bluntly, a bubble will burst. Now the problem is not only that too much has been built in small cities, the problem is that even if developers want to put the brakes on when they see the pinch coming, they simply won't be able to do so. Today, there are many half-built homes in regions where fewer and fewer people live. In particular, it is estimated that it will take more than 10 years to complete all the half-built housing in small towns. And as you can imagine, the Chinese government is doing everything it can to prevent the bankruptcy of the developers.
China to issue $29 billion of special loans to finish housing projects.
In the meantime, one question has likely come up. Why on earth would construction companies build in places where fewer and fewer people live? Who are the buyers? Why would they want to buy those houses? The answer lies in speculation. The Chinese hardly ever buy houses to live in them. They buy them primarily to speculate. To give you an idea, the purchase of first homes in recent years has just kept falling, reaching almost 10%. That is, right now, only 1 in 10 houses in China are bought to be inhabited continuously. The rest are mainly bought to speculate on the price. This is a real outrage. The question is this a coincidence? Who has fueled this huge speculative maelstrom in China? Well, here we can point to several factors. On the one hand, the Chinese are a very thrifty society and sometimes saving too much, especially in countries with very little financial culture and history such as China, leads to bubble problems. This is nothing new. It was already seen in Japan during the 1990s, in the crisis of 27 in the US, and even in the real estate boom of 2008. But, VisualEconomik viewers, in this whole story, there is one fundamental factor that must be taken into account. If you look at this graph, the Chinese real estate boom started after the 2008 crisis, and that is no coincidence. From that year on, the government decided to take a gamble and pour a lot of money into the real estate sector, a very labor-intensive sector. What's more, as we explained in a previous video, local governments started to go into debt to invest heavily in new infrastructure, further fueling the construction bubble. In other words, the bubble has not only been the result of private speculation, but mainly of the fueling from the Chinese government, which has overheated the sector. Yet, in all of this, there is still something important to consider. And if you remember, those who argue that the bubble is false, or at least exaggerated, say that Chinese GDP is much higher than the figures show, due to the underground economy, and to the fact that we Westerners are not capable of interpreting the statistics correctly. Therefore, in reality, the presence of the construction industry as a percentage of GDP would be smaller than it appears to be. Or, to put it another way, that no matter how much the real estate sector falls, especially in small cities, this will not affect the economy too much, since it is much bigger than it is believed to be. The question is this true? Well, take a look at this graph. What you're looking at is a calculation of the underground economy in various countries by Friedrich Schneider, the most renowned economist in this field. This estimate is made in several ways. For example, by analyzing electricity consumption, studying accounting discrepancies, or conducting direct surveys of citizens. And the conclusion is clear. Yes, China has a greater underground economy than the rest of the world's major countries, but it is not off the charts either. At best, China would be 12% richer than the figures reflect, if they are accurate. You are aware that there are suspicions that the Chinese government may be sugarcoating some of the data. In any case, even if the Chinese economy were actually 12% larger than is believed, the underground economy would also incorporate many activities related to the real estate market itself. So no, sorry, but that's not a compelling argument against the bubble theory. On the other hand, China has been registering increasingly lower growth rates in recent years. Of course, this is not to say that China is sinking, but the truth is that its growth rates do not seem to be able to support the huge gap between housing prices and people's incomes either. In other words, both current growth and expectations about China's economic future are much more tepid than housing prices reflect. And VisualEconomik community, to all this, we must add one last factor that often goes unnoticed.
China will lose half its population by the end of the century, and the consequences will be catastrophic.
China is going to lose population. In fact, it is already losing population. That is something that will hinder its aggregate economic growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, it will also worsen the housing bubble as there will be less need for housing. As I say, none of the data looks promising in this story. Of course, we are Westerners, so maybe we don't know how to interpret the data, right? Well then, don't listen to us. Listen to the main sources, which we have used to make this video, which you can find listed in the description. This video is based on several academic articles written by Chinese economists who have warned about and analyzed in depth the problem of the Chinese real estate bubble. We're talking about professionals such as Huang, an economist from Fudan University in Shanghai, and an analyst at the Peterson Peterson Institute, Wei Xiong, a physicist from the University of Science and Technology of China and a PhD in finance from Duke University, and Yuanqing Yang, PhD in finance from Tsinghua University in Beijing. So the question is no longer whether or not there is a real estate bubble in China. The question is when it will fully burst, how it will burst, and whether or not the government will be able to limit the consequences. And this is where the debate can really fire up.
Facing the bubble.
Let's be clear, China is far from doomed to economic death after the predictable bursting of the real estate bubble. At the end of the day, China is still a relatively poor country. It has plenty of room to improve and grow its economy, and despite the problems, it will certainly have the tools to move forward. Crises are normal in all countries, and China has been able to overcome them on many occasions. The question is, when will the real estate crisis arrive? How serious will it be? And how will the Chinese government be able to mitigate its effects? Well, on the one hand, the fall of the developer Evergrande, the constant slump in real estate prices suffered by China since 2019, and the worrying consumption and production data could be indicators that the bubble bursting has already begun, and the worst is yet to come in the next few years. However, this does not mean that the bubble will explode soon, or even that it will explode at all. In fact, the Chinese government is doing everything possible to delay the bursting of the bubble and a possible crisis.
China bets $1.8 trillion of construction will boost economy.
As long as the government keeps the bubble going and keeps baiting the real estate companies with money, it will be able to delay the problem. But what's the point of delaying it if it's going to come anyway? Well, delaying the problem could be a strategy to allow the bubble to deflate little by little, thus facilitating the absorption of the economic damage over time. For example, one thing the government could do is to boost housing construction in the big cities and move all the workers from places with bubble problems to places where new housing is really needed. One problem with large Chinese cities is that they currently have many limitations on construction, and no matter how much the demand for housing increases, construction companies are unable to invest in them. Promoting such a transition could prevent job losses and save households from a very abrupt shock. In any case, this strategy is not gratuitous. If the government continues to bait the bubble, however much it may be to delay the problems and dilute them over time, all the money that it devotes to the construction sector is money that will stop going to the productive economy. Factories, scientists, large technology companies are losing a multitude of resources because the real estate sector is taking up a large chunk of the country's resources. This could be very damaging to the long-term growth of the Asian giant, although many think it could be the least bad solution of all. In short, perhaps the Chinese crisis will not be a full-blown recession, especially considering that this is a country with plenty of room for growth. However, it is very likely that China will face a severe stagnation in its main economic driver. Will they be able to solve it in other ways? Will China manage to start a new engine in its economy after the real estate slump? Only time will tell. No one has a crystal ball. Economics poses scenarios, like doctors. But the point is that the data point to what they point to. A big real estate bubble. A big problem that China will have to solve one way or another. So now it's your turn. How do you think the Chinese bubble will affect its economic growth? What would you do to deal with the effects of its bursting? Do you think Xi Jinping's government will manage to save the situation? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visual Economic, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel, hit that little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, please like it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you soon.